Here's a question that divides empirical economists. When do I need a complex structural model, and when will a much simpler approach do the job? This is like asking which is better, a simple light switch or really ornate control panel. The answer is that neither one is inherently better than the other, but it just depends on the job that needs to be done. The most important distinction between more complex and less structural methods is what type of policy we want to analyze. And specifically, has that policy already been enacted, or is it something we're considering doing? Policy evaluation is the analysis of policies that have already been implemented. For example, about a decade ago, the city of Seattle raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour. And so we might wonder, did this cause changes to the labor market in Seattle, Washington? And there's different ways that we can answer that question, and there's actually a number of papers that have tried to answer that question. Another example is if we give $1,500 per semester to Pell Grant recipients, is that going to improve college graduation rates? So these are both policies that have actually been implemented, and so we can look at the effects of those policies on whatever outcomes we're interested in. For the minimum wage, it might be we want to know, did it affect unemployment? Did it change capital intensity in the areas that was affected by the wage? On the Pell Grant side, we might care about college graduation or year-over-year retention. We might want to know, did it affect college major choice, and so on. On the other side, we have policy design. Policy design says, what is the optimal value of this policy variable that we're considering? For the minimum wage example, it asks, what is the best level of the minimum wage that will help protect workers but also not distort labor markets? What is the best level of the Pell Grant that will not cost the government too much money but will still help students in need to get the financial assistance that they need to continue their studies? So that's the main difference between less structural or more simple methods and more structural or more complex methods. So when should I use a simpler method? So this would be something like a randomized control trial or instrumental variables or difference in differences. So typically this will be most useful when we're analyzing specific policies that have already been implemented. When we don't really care about why the treatment works, we just want to know that it works or not. When we're studying local effects, meaning we don't really care about the generalizability. And when the stakes are immediate because we need a precise answer quickly. Another consideration could be that the implementation is straightforward. So we just need to know if it works or if it doesn't work, and it's very clear what's being implemented. So these less involved or simpler methods, they're sort of like, we have this pill, is it going to make you healthier or not? We don't really care about all of the biochemistry that's going on in the body that's going to result in the change in health status. We just care about, is this pill going to be good or bad? The main weakness of these simpler methods is that they treat mechanisms as a black box. And what I mean by that is we know that treatment causes outcome, but we don't know why or through what mechanisms. So as an example, we can say we have a job training program, and the people who are randomized into our job training program, they earn 15% higher wages after the program. Therefore, the program is effective. But we want to know why. Are the workers in this program actually learning new skills? Are they instead just, this program is offered by a reputable institution, so it's facilitating signaling? Is it just that the workers are becoming more self-confident in their existing abilities, and that's what the program is doing? So it's important to know why the program is working the way it is if we want to think about tweaking the program to make the world better or to make it more effective. So if we need to know the mechanism, then we're going to need to open the black box, and that's going to require us to add more structure to our model. So here are some situations when we would be better served to use more structural methods. So first is if we want to analyze hypothetical policies. We can't run a randomized control trial on a policy that hasn't happened, and so we're going to need a different way of figuring out what the best policy should be. Another situation would be if we're interested in general equilibrium effects. So if we go back to that job training example, if the question is if we gave all of the workers the job training so that they all had better skills, then would that still result in a 15% higher wage for the people who finish the job training? Or is there something about in equilibrium, if everybody gets this additional skill, then nobody's better off because there's no way to differentiate between different employees. So the simpler approaches are going to hold all else equal, including these general equilibrium effects, and that's going to limit our ability to conclude what might happen in equilibrium. Another situation is if we're interested in dynamic or forward-looking behavior. So what do we mean by that? Well, expectations about what happens in the future might affect what I decide to do today. And so if I have a situation where the people that I'm modeling are making these forward-looking decisions, then that's going to require me to model that, and that's going to require something with more structure on it. Another example is multiple mechanisms that have opposing effects. So if you go back to econ principles, there are income and substitution effects if there's a change in relative prices in the economy. Another example from the job training that I discussed earlier is the general equilibrium effect. So maybe there's a partial equilibrium, 15% increase in wages for the people that earn this job training certificate, but then some of those wage gains get lost in general equilibrium as more and more people get the certificate. So if we don't have a model with sufficient structure, we won't be able to tell apart the partial and the general equilibrium effects. So the nice thing about modeling these different mechanisms separately is that we can distinguish between them. So we can tell, okay, well, the reason treatment is affecting outcome is because of this channel and not because of this other channel. And then once we understand the mechanisms, then we can optimize the policy according to what the mechanisms say the policy is operating through. And then we can design new interventions, or we can predict the current intervention under consideration in a new context. So these are kind of the advantages of adding more of this structure. What's the downside to adding more structure? Well, we don't really know if the model is valid. It takes a lot of effort to validate the model, whereas with less structure, we can just appeal to the design of the experiment. We can do balance checks to see if the identification assumptions we're making appear to be fulfilled. Most of the time identifying assumptions are not testable, but we can kind of look at breadcrumbs in the data to see if it's likely that they're being satisfied. And so with a more complex model, we need to validate the model and actually, see if it's working according as we think it is, if it's predicting other states of the world that we can see, and that takes a lot more work. There's also more work on the computational time. So as we'll see in later videos in this series, it's not just a simple linear regression that we can run to get the answers that we need, and that's going to take more time and more specialized skills. And then because that takes more time, then we're waiting around tapping our foot while the numbers are crunching, and so we don't know, that's a downside to finding the right answer to the question. If I told you, you can get 80% of the answer in 20% of the time, then most people would take that. Not that it's always 80-20 is the trade-off, but hopefully you understand that we have trade-offs and we want to optimize the trade-offs, and so that's going to govern which approach we choose to do. There's an ongoing literature that is combining different methods along this structural spectrum and doing things in a specific order that can give us the right amount of knowledge at the right time. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if we want to really change the world, we should start with descriptive work to measure what's happening. Then we should do simpler structural methods to understand how current policies are resulting in the environment that we see or the outcomes that we see in the world. And then we can move from there to more structural methods that will help us design optimal policies that would hopefully improve the world for the next generation or just in the future more generally. So that's kind of what I view as combining all of these approaches together, doing different levels of structure for different types of questions, and that's how we can use science to iteratively build on what we know and hopefully design policies that are going to make people better off, because that's one of the main goals of economic research. So if you're asking yourself, should I be using less structure or more structure? Here's a checklist that you can kind of ask yourself that will provide you with more answers to these questions, that will give you some guidance about which method should be used. So first is, are you analyzing an existing policy or a hypothetical policy? That's the first decision tree node. Next, do I want to understand mechanisms or am I happy with net effects? Third, are there important equilibrium or dynamic effects that I need to take into consideration? Fourth, how long do I have to do the analysis? Is this something that I need next month, or is it okay if I have a number in 2 years? Finally, what are the stakes if I'm wrong? That's another thing to keep in mind as you consider the trade-offs between less structure and more structure. So in the end, we can go back to the light switch analogy. Sometimes we need a quick, easy flip of a single switch. Other times we need a control panel that might take us a little while to get trained on how to use properly, but can deliver a much more tailored experience to what we're trying to do. Next time, we'll talk about how more structure helps with external validity of our estimates. So I hope to see you in the next video.